I never imagined that, at 42 years old, my life would take such an unexpected turn. My name is Edward, and I'm a forest ranger. My routine is simple. I patrol the green areas, take care of the flora and fauna, and spend most of my time alone, immersed in the solitude of nature. Solitude, by the way, has always been my most faithful companion. Since I separated from my wife 5 years ago, I've learned to live with silence and the absence of touch. Paul came into my life like a gentle breeze, but it quickly turned into a storm. He's the son of my new wife, Clara, a sweet and dedicated woman who, like me, carries the scars of a troubled past. Paul is 19, a biology student, and came to spend the holidays at the beach house where I live. From the very first moment, I felt something strange when I looked at him. It wasn't just his youthful beauty, his slim and muscular body, or his green eyes that seemed to hide secrets. It was something deeper, something that disturbed me and, at the same time, attracted me. I catch myself watching him when he's not looking. His movements are graceful, almost feline, and there's an energy in him that seems to challenge the world around him. He's young, full of life, and I'm just a mature man, trying to understand why my heart races every time he's near. Clara doesn't seem to notice the tension growing between us. She's too busy with her remote work and spends most of her time in the bedroom, leaving Paul and me alone in the living room or on the porch. At night, when we sit down to dinner, I feel the weight of his gaze on me, as if he's also trying to decipher what's going on in my mind. I wonder if he feels the same, if he notices the way my breath falters when he leans over to pick something up, or how my body tenses when he passes by me, his soft scent of sunscreen and sea salt invading my senses. But I can't give in to these thoughts. I'm a married man, and he's my stepson. This is wrong, immoral, forbidden. And yet, the more I try to convince myself of that, the harder it becomes to ignore the desire growing inside me. Something is about to happen. I can feel it in the air, like the electricity before a storm. It was on a hot summer afternoon that it all began. Clara had gone to the city to take care of some errands, and Paul and I were alone in the house. He was in the living room, stretching on the floor, while I read a book on the couch. The sound of the waves crashing on the beach filled the silence between us, but my attention was far from the book. My eyes were drawn to him like a magnet, watching every movement, every muscle that tensed under his tight shirt. Suddenly, he turned to me, his green eyes shining with a playful light. "Edward, have you ever practiced martial arts?" I shook my head, trying to ignore the way his muscles stood out under his tight shirt. "No, I've never been good at contact sports." He smiled, and something about that smile made my stomach churn. "I'll teach you. It's easy, I promise." Before I could protest, he stood up and extended his hand to me. His fingers touched mine for a moment, and I felt an electric shock run up my arm. He pulled me up with surprising strength, and I found myself standing so close to him that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Let's start with something basic," he said, positioning himself in front of me. "Try to take me down." I hesitated, but he insisted. "Come on, Edward. You won't hurt me." With a sigh, I tried to push him, but he dodged easily, grabbing my arm and pulling me to the ground. We fell together, and I felt the weight of his body on top of mine. He was above me, his knees on either side of my waist, and his hands held my wrists firmly. "You need to be faster," he said, laughing, but I could barely hear him. His body was warm, firm, and I felt a wave of desire so intense it almost made me lose control. Our faces were so close that I could count every detail of his features. His green eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. There was something in that gaze, something that made me forget everything around me. He didn't move, and neither did I. It was as if we were stuck in a moment of unbearable tension, each waiting for the other to do something. My mind screamed for me to pull away to stop this before it was too late, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt the heat of his skin, the smell of sweat mixed with something more intense, more masculine. It was intoxicating. He leaned in a little more, and for a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. My heart raced, and I felt a mix of fear and desire that left me dizzy. His lips were so close I could almost feel them touching mine. But then he stopped. His eyes moved away from mine, and he released my wrists, rolling to the side and sitting on the floor. "You need more practice," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, as if he too was fighting something. I sat up, trying to catch my breath and regain my composure. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I had just run a marathon. "Maybe another day," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He looked at me, and again, I saw something in his eyes that made me wonder if he was feeling what I was feeling. But he didn't say anything, just stood up and extended his hand to help me up. When our hands touched, I felt another wave of electricity run through my body. He pulled me up, and for a moment, our bodies pressed together again. He didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. We stood there still, so close that I could feel the heat of his skin against mine. "Edward," he whispered, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. I looked at him, and again, I felt that unbearable tension between us. It was as if the world around us had disappeared, and only the two of us existed. But then, he took a step back, releasing my hand. "Let's get some water," he said, his voice a little firmer, as if he was trying to convince himself that nothing had happened. I nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. But one thing I knew, something had changed between us, and there was no going back. The storm arrived without warning. The sky, which had been clear, darkened in a matter of minutes, and soon the first drops of rain began to hit the windows of the house. The wind howled outside, and the sound of thunder echoed across the beach, each one louder than the last. Paul and I were on the living room couch, watching a movie we barely paid attention to. He was sitting at one end, I at the other. The distance between us seemed smaller than ever. The tension that had been growing over the past few days was there, palpable, as if the air around us was charged with electricity, just like the storm outside. "Edward," he said suddenly, his voice soft, almost lost in the sound of the rain. I turned to him, trying to maintain my composure. "What is it, Paul?" He looked at me, his green eyes reflecting the dim light of the TV. "Do you think it's going to last long?" I understood he was talking about the storm. "I don't know," I replied, trying to ignore the way his body seemed to lean toward me, but it seemed strong. He didn't say anything else, just nodded and turned back to the TV, but I couldn't focus on the movie. My mind was too occupied with him, with the way his fingers drummed on the arm of the couch, with how he always seemed so close, even when he wasn't. After a while, the tension in the room became unbearable. I stood up, trying to disguise the restlessness I felt. "I'm going to the room to rest for a bit," I said, my voice a little rougher than I would have liked. Paul looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something. But he just nodded, his eyes following me as I left the room. In the bedroom, I lay on the bed, trying to calm down. The rain beat hard against the windows, and the sound of thunder seemed to echo inside me. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that all of this was just my imagination, that I was creating something out of nothing. But then I heard the bedroom door open. "Edward?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant. I turned and saw Paul standing in the doorway, his body illuminated by the faint light from the hallway. He was holding a pillow, and his expression was a mix of vulnerability and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "What is it, Paul?" I asked, sitting up on the bed. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I can't sleep with this storm. Can I stay here with you?" I hesitated for a moment, my mind fighting against what I knew was right and what my body desperately wanted. But then I nodded, scooting over to make room for him on the bed. He lay down beside me, and for a moment we were silent, listening to the sound of the rain outside, but the tension between us was so strong I could barely breathe. He was so close that I could feel the heat of his body, the smell of his shampoo mixed with something more intense, more masculine. "Edward," he whispered, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. I turned to him, and our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something that made me forget everything around me. He didn't say anything, just leaned in, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both sweet and intense. His kiss was delicious, warm, and I felt a wave of desire so strong it almost made me lose control. I pulled him closer, responding to the kiss with an intensity that surprised me. Our bodies intertwined, and I felt his hands exploring my body with an urgency that matched mine. "Paul," I whispered against his lips, my voice rough and full of desire. He didn't respond, just deepened the kiss, his hands gripping me with a strength that made me feel desired, needed. It was as if all the tension we had built up over the past few days had finally found an outlet, and now we were completely surrendered to each other. The warmth of the morning was already beginning to seep into the house when I left the bedroom, feeling my body still heavy from the events of the previous night. Something inside me screamed that we'd crossed a line, but at that moment I didn't have the strength to pull back. The faint scent of the sheets mixed with the smell of his skin, still warm from sleep, and for a moment I hesitated before getting out of bed. In the bathroom, the hot water from the shower ran over my skin, but it didn't wash away the marks of that night. The touches, the muffled whispers, the heat of his body pressed against mine. I took a deep breath, trying to reorganize my thoughts, but the memory was still there, throbbing in every part of me. After getting dressed, I went straight to the kitchen to make coffee. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee spread through the room, mingling with the subtle scent of the sea breeze coming through the open window. As I set the table, my mind wandered, replaying everything that had happened and trying to understand what would come next. I went to the bedroom to call him. Paul was still lying down, the sheet partially fallen over his waist, exposing his sun-kissed skin and the defined outline of his relaxed muscles. For a moment I stood there just watching him breathe, his chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm, his slightly messy hair contrasting with the softness of his sleeping face. "Paul," I called, my voice coming out softer than I intended. He stirred slowly, opening his eyes gradually, and when his gaze met mine, I felt something warm ignite inside me again. He stretched lazily before getting up, swinging his legs off the bed and rubbing his face with his hands. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice still hoarse with sleep. "Come have some coffee," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. We had coffee together, the conversation flowing lightly, but there was something different between us. A silence that hadn't been there before, an exchange of glances that said more than words. It was as if we both knew that nothing would ever be the same again, but neither of us was ready to say it out loud. Later, we decided to walk along the beach. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of the sea, and the soft sand beneath our feet felt inviting. We had 4 whole days alone, 4 days to find a way to pass the time without the new weight between us becoming unbearable. But deep down, I knew that no matter how much we tried to fill the days with walks, conversations, and comfortable silences, what really hung between us was the uncertainty of what would come next. The warm sea breeze carried the salty smell of the waves, mixed with the gentle sound of the water breaking against the sand. We walked without hurry, feeling the sun warm our skin and the wind tussle our hair, when Paul suddenly stopped and pointed to a small cluster of palm trees a little further ahead. "Let's rest in that shade for a bit," he said, his voice calm but firm. I nodded, and we headed there. The sand beneath our feet was warm, but under the trees, the coolness was a welcome relief. We sat side by side, letting our bodies relax. I crossed my arms behind my head, feeling the soft touch of the sand, and Paul did the same beside me. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, there was something intimate and natural about it. The sun filtered through the tall leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on our bodies, while the gentle breeze passed over our sweaty skin, bringing a subtle coolness. The heat of the day seemed less intense there, but the heat between us remained present, silent, just waiting to be acknowledged. Paul closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as if he wanted to absorb that moment. I glanced at him, trying to understand what was going through his mind, but without the courage to ask. Time seemed to slow down there between the sound of the waves, the distant call of seagulls, and Paul's calm breathing beside me. We didn't say anything. It wasn't necessary. There was something in the way our bodies rested close to each other, in the way our breaths seemed to sink, that already said everything we needed to know. The gentle breeze continued to blow, carrying the smell of the sea and the warmth of the sand beneath our bodies. We stayed there, side by side, breathing in that comfortable silence, until Paul lifted his head, looking around carefully. His eyes scanned the deserted beach, making sure we were completely alone. Then, without saying a word, he leaned toward me. His face approached slowly, and my heart raced before I even understood what was about to happen. When our lips finally touched, the world around us seemed to disappear. The kiss was full of passion and desire, intense and inevitable, as if something that had been contained for a long time had finally found a way to break free. His breath mingled with mine, and for a moment, all that existed was that contact, warm and deep. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just the moment, charged with a silent electricity. When the kiss ended, Paul didn't say anything. He just lay on my chest, resting there, while the sound of the waves continued to break in the distance. My heart was still racing, and I knew that something inside me had changed forever. The shade of the palm trees was a perfect refuge, and for a while, we stayed there, unhurried, letting time flow slowly. Paul's body still rested on mine, his rhythmic breathing matching the sound of the waves breaking in the distance. The heat of the day still enveloped us, but at that moment, nothing seemed to matter except that feeling of peace. But soon reality called us back. We needed to go home to prepare lunch. With a sigh, we got up and shook the sand off our skin before starting to walk back. The sun was still shining brightly, making our shadows stretch across the soft sand as we walked side by side in silence. When we got home, I went straight to the shower. The warm water ran over my body, washing away the salt of the sea and the sweat from the walk, but my mind was still stuck in that moment under the palm trees, in the memory of Paul's touch, the way he had lain against me as if that were the most natural place in the world. After the shower, I went to the kitchen to start organizing things for a barbecue. The smell of the lit charcoal soon began to spread through the air, mixing with the freshness of the breeze coming through the house. Meanwhile, Paul was in the shower, and I could hear the sound of the water running, bringing involuntary images to my mind. When he came out of the bathroom, still drying his hair with a towel, he gave me a carefree smile as he saw me fiddling with the grill. Without saying a word, he grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, opened one, and handed me the other. We toasted in silence before taking the first sip, feeling the cold liquid refresh our throats, a perfect contrast to the heat of the day. The smell of the meat began to spread, and as we waited for it to cook, we drank slowly, enjoying that simple moment, but charged with something new that neither of us yet knew how to name. Lunch was light and relaxed. Between one beer and another, easy laughter and jokes that made everything feel even more natural. The smell of the barbecue still lingered in the air, mixed with the warm breeze coming through the porch. The day continued like that, unhurried, without demands, just the two of us, enjoying that temporary freedom, exploring the unknown without fear of tomorrow. In the days that followed, many things happened. We explored sensations I had never imagined feeling, crossed boundaries that once seemed insurmountable. We discovered things about ourselves that we might not have even known were there, waiting to be awakened. But unfortunately, I can't tell you everything here. If you want the uncut version with all the details, the link is in the pinned comments. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. My wife arrives tonight. I'll be back later to tell you how it's going. Kisses, and see you soon.